Welcome to Embrace Joy, Walking the Road to Restoration. I don't know about you, but this week has been very difficult. I am heartbroken knowing that so many children were affected by the mass shooting in Nashville. Just a couple months ago, there was also a shooting at Michigan State University, which is not too far from me. And so these traumatic events make us understand that we are not in control. But we need to stand stronger together. We need to seek out safety for each one of us. I want to touch on today a little bit about what is trauma. What are some of the effects of trauma? Things that we need to watch out for in our children to know how they are dealing with life, especially right now. As we talk about trauma, I am also going to try to answer the question, why do bad things happen to good people? And then we'll talk a little bit about how we can make sure that we are living in a safe community and do as much as possible to keep our children and ourselves safe. My name is Joy LaPiccolo, and I am a trauma survivor. I have spent over 20 years working with other trauma survivors. I am a certified life transformational coach. I offer inner healing prayer. I have over 15 years of teaching experience, and I also help individuals with health and nutrition. So, what actually is trauma? Trauma is an emotional response, often lasting a long period of time, and that emotional response often results from living through a distressing event. Experiencing a traumatic event can harm a person's sense of safety. It affects their identity. Many individuals are not able to regulate their emotions and have healthy relationships. Even after the traumatic event occurs, people with trauma can still feel shame, helplessness, feeling powerlessness, and fear. And those feelings can last for a long time after the traumatic event. Some of the studies that I was looking at were frightening to me. It is stated that just in the United States alone, 87% of the population have experienced one or more traumatic events. And that's the reason why I wanted to do this podcast, especially in related to the mass shootings. Mass shootings have actually risen by 30% just since 2020. When we think about sexual abuse, 1 out of 3 women and 1 out of 5 men have been sexually abused or experienced a sexual assault. So, unfortunately, or fortunately, you are not alone. Trauma is not just something experienced in the military. There are different types of trauma. Not everyone has experienced them. You may not even know someone who has experienced some of these types of trauma. But I want to kind of go through a couple things on a list that I created of the different types of trauma. One of the lists that often people will break it down is type 1, which is considered a event that is sudden, something that only happens one time. Type 2 trauma is often described as complex trauma, and these are events that are repeated. Many of them are common in childhood. So, my heart goes out to you if you have experienced some of these traumas. Again, you are not alone. I can relate very well to many of these types of traumas that I'm going to go through. So if you want to jot these down or you want to get back with me, I'm going to do a transcript of this podcast and have them up on my blog as well so you can see these lists. So, type 1, again, are events that may only happen one time. Maybe a severe illness or injury, violent or sexual assault, a traumatic loss, being a victim of or witness to violence. And going back to the mass shootings, even if those children did not see the shooter, maybe they did not see those individuals who died, they were still victims of that violence, not just the children, but the teachers and, of course, the parents. Another type 1 trauma is witnessing a natural disaster, a car accident, hospitalization, if you have gone through childbirth or any type of medical trauma, that would be considered a type 1 trauma. And if you have had a life threatening illness or diagnosis. Type 2, again, is considered complex trauma, where a lot of these events happen more than one time. Sibling abuse, childhood emotional abuse, domestic violence, emotional abuse or neglect, long term misdiagnosis of a health problem. And I work with a lot of people who have chronic illness, and medical trauma is more prevalent than you think. Also, bullying, not just in the home, but at school, or maybe you are experiencing bullying in the workplace. Sexual abuse, emotional abuse, physical neglect, and a very strict upbringing. There are a couple other types of trauma that I was thinking of when it comes to generational. We talk about generational curses quite a bit when I work with trauma survivors. And so racism is something that is carried down from generation to generation. You may have your family may have experienced slavery, so then that trauma has continued down into your life. Other traumas that may be experienced by you that were not on the other two lists is being removed from your family or community, for example, being a refugee. But I was also thinking about children who their parents are incarcerated. And so often the child is placed into a foster home. A loss of a loved one, moving to a new house is another type of trauma. Going through a divorce, maybe losing a job, losing a business. So the types of traumas that you have experienced may not be one that I listed, but I want you to know that in this life we will have trial, we have tribulation, but there is hope. God has made possible the impossible, and with Him, all things will be made for good. So, we talked about what is trauma, we talked about some of the types of trauma. What about the effects of trauma? Now, the effects of trauma can happen physically, mentally, spiritually, and it's different for each individual. One person can go through the same traumatic event as another and experience it differently. So, one individual may not have any effects, another person could have life altering effects. With a traumatic event, there are individuals who want to avoid any feelings related to it. So they often will live in isolation, which of course leads to depression. They actually may have suicidal tendencies. They may turn to addictive behaviors, either drugs, alcohol, pornography, food. And with that avoidance, it is very common for individuals to use self harm as a calming, which is non calming. Individuals may just not be able to function. It's difficult to make decisions. Relationships are difficult to manage. Our bodies are actually programmed to live in fight or flight. And so we often re experience the trauma over and over again with flashbacks or looking at every situation around us and determining if we need to fight or flight. Couple other effects with traumatic events is hyperarousal. Individuals are easily startled. We deal with lack of sleep, panic attacks, very common. The physical side of things, trauma affects the body in more ways than people realize. There's a book called Your Body Keeps Score, and I really encourage you to read that. It's very eye opening. But when we're thinking about children, especially those that experienced the mass shooting just recently, I was thinking about the fact that one of the signs that you can look out for is if they're having problems with digestion, their sleep, if they're complaining about headaches, if you're seeing that they are unable to make decisions, they're becoming fidgety. Maybe it's not ADHD, maybe it is trauma related. Also, looking for weight issues. Either they eat too much or they're not eating at all. And again, that's not just for the children, it's also for us as well. And oftentimes, when you go through a traumatic event, you stop taking care of yourself. Now, let's get to the hard question. This is a question that is asked over and over again in my support groups and in other situations, and that is, why do bad things happen to good people? This is a question that I asked over and over again in my life as well. So I'm going to try to explain basically why do bad things happen to good people? And it's hard to explain. Lisa Turkis wrote a book. It's called It's Not Supposed to Be This Way. An example that she gave is that we are living between two gardens. And I love her explanation of this. She talks about how God created the Garden of Eden. It was perfect. Everything that we needed was in that garden. But a choice was made, and both of the individuals sinned. They turned their back on God. And as a result, God kicked them out of that garden. So now we are living outside of the Garden of Eden, waiting for the other garden, which is in heaven, which heaven has everything that we need and for eternity. So this is not what God designed. This is not what God wanted is the health issues that we have, the natural disasters, for example. This is luckily a temporary situation until we get to heaven. But the bad things that happen to good people, it was not God's design. When we are going through these types of trauma, it leads us to realize that we need a Savior. God sent His only Son to earth to go through some of the traumas that we experience. And then He died on the cross for our sin so that we can have a relationship with Him and have the ability to go to heaven. If you have not yet reached out for Jesus to be your Savior, please know that He is there for you. He loves you. And if you would like more information about having a relationship with Christ, please get back with me. But we need a Savior, especially with making it through life. I mentioned before about the Garden of Eden where they had a freedom to choose how they were going to live their life. So they had everything perfect, like I mentioned. And God gave them the choice to eat from any tree in the garden except for one. So with that freedom to choose, they chose wrong. And now, in this life between two gardens, individuals around us have the freedom to choose as well. Their choices then affect us. For example, my sexual abuse that happened as a child, that perpetrator made a choice to have a violent nature. There was a lot of mental illness in his family. That didn't make it okay, but it's easier to understand why he made that particular choice. So, because he chose violence, my life was traumatically affected. So, freedom to choose is something that God has allowed, but people use it for the wrong reasons. Remember that God's power is greater than we could ever imagine. Joseph was sold into slavery by his own brothers. He went through extreme poverty, scarcity, um, betrayal. But when his brothers came back needing help, they were afraid to be around him because they knew what they had done to him. And he says to them, "What you meant for evil, God has made for good." So no matter what trauma, trial, or tribulation you have experienced, God is making it for good. Your trauma will become your testimony, and you will be able to help individuals more than you could ever imagine. I came across a quote by Cherie Hill. She wrote the book Waiting on God, and she says, "Every difficulty you face, in every waiting place, you are being given a chance to trust in the things unseen and to be abundantly blessed." And we may not know the reason why. We may never know the reason why, but trusting in God, we definitely will experience abundant life and restoration. So, how do we make sure we stand stronger together and have safety in our community? Never too early to talk to your children about bad touch, good touch, making sure you protect your home, where if you're watching the news, the children walk in, they're going to be mentally affected. So, what are you actually watching? What are they watching? What type of video games are they listening to? Very important to watch what they're watching, watch what you're watching to make sure that you are removing any type of chance for trauma mentally. Gun safety, of course, is very important. Now, I have my CPL, but I make sure that I am trained as to when to use a weapon and only when I am in extreme danger, and to make sure that those weapons are in an area that no one can get to. So make sure that you are keeping any type of weapon in a safe location, a locked box. Relating to safety as well, we need to make sure we acknowledge the trauma. You may not have lived in Nashville. You may not have witnessed a mass shooting, and you may want to live in denial that it actually happened. But as you know, it affects every race, social, economic status. Now we realize that it's not just in a public school, but it's in a private Christian school. Doesn't matter if it's male or female. You need to acknowledge that that trauma actually existed. And if you went through that particular type of trauma, like one of the ones on the list, you need to feel the feelings. Once you feel the feelings, that will help you feel safer. Practice self care. You are so important. So make sure that you are practicing self care. Have purpose in your life. We can't change the type of trauma that we went through, but we can learn from it and move forward with what we've learned. Creating that purpose, because God gave us a plan and a purpose, a hope and a future, and to walk in that. Get up each morning, put your feet one step at a time, and move forward. Remember, we are walking the road to restoration and we want to live in freedom. When we're talking about seeking safety, always ask for help. If any of those traumas that you have been listening to please know that you can ask for professional help. I also offer one on one coaching as well. I will also list in the description some of the hotlines that you can reach out to if you know of someone who is experiencing trauma or if you are experiencing trauma as well. With the one on one coaching, I have one coaching program that is for 4 weeks, which is on standing firm when the world is shaking. The 12-week coaching program that I offer is called Living on Purpose. Again, I offer inner healing prayer. Remember that joy is available to you. No matter what trauma you have experienced, God promises an abundant life. And let's continue walking this road to restoration.